In the ruins of 1945 Germany, the air still smelled of gunpowder and ash. Anna Müller, a 26-year-old German nurse, stood trembling beside a line of prisoners, hands raised, expecting the worst. When the American soldiers approached, she couldn't breathe. She had heard stories whispered in basements and bomb shelters, tales of revenge, cruelty, humiliation. The victors would come for blood. That's what war demanded. That's what history taught. But instead of hatred, one soldier lowered his rifle. Private James Carter, a farm boy from Iowa, with dust still in his boots and weariness etched into his face, let his weapon drop to his side. His blue eyes softened as he saw the terrified woman clutching a half-burned Red Cross badge against her chest like a shield made of paper and hope. He looked at her for a long moment, longer than mercy usually allows in wartime. Then he spoke, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "You saved lives," he said. "That makes you one of us." Anna didn't understand the words. Not completely, but she understood the tone. It was the first time in 3 years that someone had looked at her and seen a human being instead of an enemy. Weeks later, when the war officially ended and church bells rang across a continent that had forgotten the sound, Anna found herself in an American-run refugee camp on the outskirts of Munich. Every morning, she watched James and his unit bringing food to hollow-eyed children, fixing roofs with salvaged timber, speaking German with clumsy accents that made the old women smile despite themselves. And one day, he handed her a piece of paper, a form she didn't recognize, covered in English words she was still learning to read. "Not a prisoner," he told her, pointing to the document. "A bride." She thought it was a cruel joke. Soldiers made those sometimes. But when he knelt in the rubble 3 days later, in a courtyard where roses had once grown, holding a ring he'd fashioned from a spent bullet shell, polished, smooth, and bright, Anna realized something impossible had happened. Love had survived the war. What began as mercy would become one of history's most unlikely love stories. The story of the German war brides who crossed oceans not as captives, but as wives. Women who had been enemies before they became mothers, strangers before they became Americans. Their journey would test every assumption about hatred and healing, about whether the human heart could forgive what the human mind could never forget. Berlin fell on May 2nd, 1945. The city that had once crowned itself the capital of a 1,000-year empire crumbled in 17 days. When the final shots echoed through Brandenburg Gate, what remained was a landscape that looked like the surface of a dead planet. Buildings stood gutted and hollow, their windows like empty eye sockets. Streets disappeared under mountains of brick and mortar, and everywhere, smoke rose in gray columns, mixing with clouds until it seemed the sky itself was made of ash. Anna had worked at Charité Hospital until the bombs made surgery impossible. When the walls came down, she moved to the basement, then to the subway tunnels, then finally to a makeshift clinic in what used to be a bakery. She treated whoever came through the door: German soldiers with gangrene, Polish forced laborers with pneumonia, children with shrapnel embedded so deep that her hands shook when she dug it out. By the time the Americans arrived, she had been working for 48 hours straight, functioning on adrenaline and the muscle memory of mercy. The refugees huddled in clusters when the American jeeps rolled in, convinced this was the moment they would pay for the sins of the regime. Anna stood with a group of nurses and doctors, wearing a white armband that had long since turned gray. She prayed in a language she'd almost forgotten, childhood prayers from before the world went mad. She prayed that death would be quick, that they wouldn't separate her from the others, that history would remember they had tried to heal, even when healing seemed pointless. James Carter stepped out of the lead jeep with his rifle raised, scanning the crowd with the careful eyes of someone who had learned not to trust stillness. He was 23 years old and looked 50. His uniform was caked with mud and dried blood, his face unshaven, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that made his bones ache. He'd landed at Normandy 11 months ago. Since then, he'd seen things that would visit him in dreams for the rest of his life. He'd learned to hate efficiently, to kill without hesitation, to turn off every soft part of himself that might interfere with survival. But when he saw Anna standing there with that badge, that small piece of cloth, that meant she had chosen healing over hate, something in him cracked open. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was the memory of his mother, who had been a nurse in the Great War. Maybe it was simply that he'd reached the limit of how much hatred a human heart can hold before it collapses under the weight. He lowered his rifle and walked toward her. The other soldiers watched, uncertain. The refugees watched, terrified. Anna watched, unable to move, unable to breathe, certain this was some elaborate prelude to execution. "English?" James asked. She shook her head. "Ein bisschen," she whispered. "A little," he nodded slowly, thinking. Then he pointed to her badge. "Red Cross? Ja." "Yes." Her voice was barely audible. "Hospital?" He mimed, bandaging an arm. "Yes." "Hospital. Charité." She pointed vaguely south, toward the ruins where the famous building still stood, somehow, like a ghost too stubborn to lie down. James turned to his sergeant, a hard-faced man from Pittsburgh who'd lost 3 brothers in the Pacific. "This one's medical," he said. "Non-combatant." The sergeant spat into the dirt. "They're all non-combatants now that we won. She's a nurse. So was Irma Gress." The name hung in the air like poison. The Angel of Death, they'd called her. A nurse who'd run Bergen-Belson's crematoriums like a factory floor. James's jaw tightened. "Look at her hands." The sergeant looked. They all looked. Anna's hands were raw and scarred, the nails broken down to the quick, the fingers stained with iodine and gentian violet. They were the hands of someone who had spent years elbow-deep in wounds, someone who had sutured and splinted and sanitized until the skin wore away. They were not the hands of an executioner. The sergeant grunted. "Put her with the medical personnel. We'll sort it out later." They took Anna to a displaced persons camp, 15 miles outside the city. It had been a Wehrmacht training facility once, but the Americans had cleared out the weapons and filled the barracks with cots. Hundreds of people pressed together in rooms that smelled of unwashed bodies and fear. The latrines overflowed. The kitchen served watery soup with chunks of turnip floating like small white stones. But there were no beatings, no shootings, no midnight disappearances. After 12 years of Nazi rule, the absence of terror felt like a kind of paradise. James was assigned to guard duty, which meant walking the perimeter fence and making sure no one tried to escape, though where they would escape to in a country that had been bombed flat, no one could say. He watched Anna through the chain link, saw her moving among the children with crackers she must have saved from her own rations. She sang to them sometimes, old German folk songs that made the mothers cry. She checked their heads for lice, their throats for infection, their eyes for the glassy stare that meant malnutrition had crossed into starvation. One evening, as the sun set red over the broken landscape, James approached the fence where Anna was distributing pieces of bread to a line of children. She saw him coming and tensed, ready to defend her small charges if necessary. But James just reached into his pack and pulled out chocolate bars, 6 of them, precious as gold. He passed them through the fence without a word. Anna stared at the chocolate, then at him. "Why?" she asked in halting English. He didn't know how to answer that. Why did anyone show mercy? Why did kindness survive when everything else burned? He shrugged, feeling foolish. "Kids should have chocolate," he said. She took the bars carefully, as if they might vanish if she moved too quickly. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, quieter, "I am sorry." "For what?" "For the war. For everything." James looked at her for a long time. "You didn't start it," he said finally. "You just tried to fix what it broke." That night, he got called into the commander's office. Captain Morrison sat behind a desk that had been looted from some German official's mansion, smoking a cigar and looking at James with the weary disappointment of a man who had seen too many of his soldiers go soft. "You're fraternizing," Morrison said flatly. "I gave some kids chocolate, sir, through a German woman, a Nursesser, a German nurse." Morrison leaned forward. "Let me explain something to you, Carter. These people aren't your friends. They're not your mission. 6 months ago, they were shooting at you. Their husbands, their brothers, their fathers built the ovens we're finding in every camp we liberate. You give them chocolate today. And tomorrow, they'll spit on your grave. She's been helping the medical staff, sir. Dr. Williams says she's the best they have. I don't care if she's Florence Nightingale. You keep your distance. That's an order. James saluted and left. But that night, he lay in his bunk and thought about Anna's hands, worn raw from healing. He thought about his brother Tom, who died on Omaha Beach with his intestines in his hands, screaming for their mother. He thought about all the hate he'd carried like a backpack full of stones, and how tired he was of carrying it. In the women's barracks, Anna couldn't sleep either. She lay on her narrow cot and remembered her husband, Friedrich, who'd been conscripted in 1941 and sent to the Eastern Front. She'd received 3 letters in 2 years, each one thinner than the last, the handwriting shakier. The final letter arrived in January of 1943, postmarked from a field hospital near Stalingrad. He wrote that it was cold, that he missed her, that if he didn't make it home, she should find someone kind and start again. 3 weeks later, the official telegram came. Missing in action. Presumed dead. She'd been 23 then, already ancient by the standards of war. She threw herself into nursing, working triple shifts, sleeping 4 hours a night in hospital closets. If she stayed busy enough, the grief couldn't catch her. If she kept moving, she wouldn't have to think about the empty apartment, the wedding ring she still wore, the future that had been amputated like a gangrenous limb. Now, lying in the dark among strangers, she touched that ring and wondered if Friedrich would forgive her for what she was starting to feel. Because despite everything, despite history and hatred and the mountain of corpses piled between their nations, she found herself thinking about the American soldier with the sad eyes who gave children chocolate. She found herself looking for him during morning roll call, listening for his voice among the guards. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was the only thing that made sense. James began finding excuses to walk past the medical tent where Anna volunteered. The camp doctors had quickly realized her value and put her to work treating infections, setting bones, delivering babies. She moved through the tent with efficient grace, speaking gentle German to the patients, her hands steady even when the supplies ran out, and she had to improvise with boiled rags and prayers. One afternoon, a young American soldier was brought in with a fever that had spiked to 105 degrees. The camp doctor was performing surgery on another patient, and the medics were overwhelmed. Anna found herself alone with the delirious soldier, who was shaking so hard the cot rattled. She recognized him from James's unit. She'd seen them talking, laughing, sharing cigarettes. She didn't hesitate. She stripped him down and packed him in wet sheets, forcing water between his cracked lips, singing softly in German because she didn't know what else to do. When the fever broke 3 hours later, the soldier opened his eyes and saw her sitting beside him, exhausted and worried. "Angel," he mumbled in English. She didn't understand the word, but she understood the gratitude in his voice. James heard about it from his squad mates, who couldn't stop talking about how the German nurse had saved Danny Mitchell's life. They said it with wonder, with confusion, with something that might have been the beginning of respect. James felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced since before the war, a feeling he'd thought had died somewhere in the French countryside. He found Anna outside the medical tent the next evening, sitting on an overturned crate and staring at nothing. She looked up when his shadow fell across her, and something passed between them that needed no translation. Recognition, understanding, the acknowledgement that they were both trying to be better than the war had made them. "Danny's doing well," James said carefully, speaking slowly so she could follow. "Thanks to you," Anna nodded, too tired for more. "He is young," she said. "Too young for dying. We all are." James sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They watched the sunset paint the ruined landscape in shades of amber and gold, making the destruction look almost beautiful. "Your German is getting better," Anna said after a while. "Your English, too." She smiled slightly. It was the first time he'd seen her smile, and it transformed her face, erasing years of exhaustion. "We teach each other. Maybe. He pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket, broke it in half, and offered her a piece. She hesitated, then took it. They sat together in the fading light, eating chocolate and not speaking, while around them the camp settled into its evening routine. It wasn't much. It wasn't romance, but it was something neither of them had felt in years. It was peace. The spring of 1946 brought new regulations. The military brass, concerned about fraternization between occupation forces and German civilians, issued strict orders. No relationships, no socializing, no marriages. Soldiers caught breaking these rules faced court-martial and dishonorable discharge. The policy was meant to maintain discipline, to prevent the very thing that was already happening in camps and towns across occupied Germany. Enemies becoming friends. Hatred becoming something softer. Anna was transferred to a different camp, 60 miles north. No warning. No explanation. She was simply told to pack her few belongings and board a truck. She had 10 minutes to gather her things. She spent those minutes searching the camp for James, but he was out on patrol. She left without saying goodbye, without knowing if she'd ever see him again. When James returned and discovered she was gone, something inside him went cold and sharp. He demanded to know why. His sergeant shrugged and said it was routine reassignment. James didn't believe it. He confronted Captain Morrison, who looked at him with a mixture of pity and frustration. "You were getting too close, Carter. We can't have our soldiers falling for the enemy." "She's not the enemy. She was 3 months ago. The war's over." "Is it?" Morrison gestured at the window, where beyond the camp walls, the landscape lay in ruins. "Tell that to the Jews we're finding in ditches. Tell that to the boys still dying from wounds they got a year ago. The war doesn't end just because we stopped shooting." James felt something break in his chest, clean and final. "Permission to put in for transfer, sir." Morrison studied him carefully. "You're really going to throw away your career for a German girl you barely know?" "I'm going to throw it away for the idea that we're supposed to be better than they were." The transfer request was denied, but James was resourceful. He found a chaplain who ran a mail service for displaced persons, and through him, he managed to get letters to Anna. They were censored, heavily redacted, but enough got through. Anna wrote back on scraps of paper, her English improving with each letter. She told him about the new camp, colder and harsher than the last. She told him about the children she cared for, orphans who had forgotten how to cry. She told him she thought about him every day, and that she was sorry for thinking about him, but she couldn't help it. James kept her letters in his breast pocket, close to his heart, folded until the creases wore through. He wrote back whenever he could, telling her about the cornfields in Iowa, about his parents' farm, about how strange it would be to go home to peace after so long at war. He told her things he'd never told anyone, about the nightmares that woke him screaming, about the guilt that followed him like a shadow, about how her kindness had reminded him that he was still human underneath all the killing. The letters became their lifeline. Words on paper, crossing the miles between them, building something fragile and fierce. In November of that year, James was rotated back to the States. He stood on the deck of a transport ship, watching the German coast disappear into fog, and felt like he was leaving part of himself behind. He had Anna's photograph, a small, grainy image taken by a camp photographer. In it, she wasn't smiling, but her eyes were clear and direct, meeting the camera without fear. He looked at that photograph every day during the crossing, memorizing her face, promising himself that this wasn't the end. In Germany, Anna stood at the fence of her camp and watched the snow fall. Winter came early that year, burying the ruins under a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. She thought about James constantly, wondered if he'd made it home safely, if he thought about her, if the distance and time would make him forget. She'd heard stories about soldiers who made promises in Europe and broke them in America. She tried to protect her heart, to lower her expectations, to prepare for disappointment, but she couldn't quite manage it. Hope, it turned out, was harder to kill than hate. 1946 became 1947. Germany began the slow, painful work of rebuilding. The Marshall Plan brought money and materials. Cities that had been moonscapes started to show signs of life. New construction, open shops, streetlights that actually worked. But for the war brides waiting in camps, progress felt glacial. They existed in limbo, neither prisoners nor free, waiting for a future that seemed perpetually delayed. Then, in December of 1946, the United States Congress passed the War Brides Act. The legislation allowed foreign-born wives and children of American servicemen to enter the United States outside normal immigration quotas. It was designed primarily for British and French brides, but it included provisions for German women who had married soldiers during the occupation. The catch was that they had to be legally married first. James read about the act in a newspaper at his parents' kitchen table in Iowa. His hands shook so badly that coffee slopped onto the newsprint. His mother, who had watched her son move through the house like a ghost for 2 months, noticed. "What is it?" she asked. He couldn't speak. He just pushed the newspaper toward her and pointed at the headline. His mother read it slowly, her lips moving, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding, to something that might have been resignation or might have been relief. "You're going to do it," she said. "Not a question. I have to. She's German, James. I know. Your brother died fighting them. I know that too." He looked at his mother, this woman who had lost one son and was terrified of losing another. "But Tom wouldn't want me to hate forever. He'd want me to find something worth living for." His mother was quiet for a long time. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. "Then, you'd better write that girl a proper proposal," she said. The letter took James 4 days to compose. He went through 20 drafts, crumpling each one and starting over, trying to find words big enough for what he felt. Finally, he settled on simplicity. He told Anna that he loved her, that he wanted to marry her, that he knew it was crazy and complicated and might not work, but he was willing to try if she was. He included all the forms she would need, instructions for applying for a visa, and a promise that he would be there, waiting, no matter how long it took. The letter traveled across the Atlantic in a mail ship, through processing centers and censors' offices, eventually reaching the camp where Anna had spent 18 months in limbo. When the camp administrator called her name and handed her the envelope with American stamps, her heart stopped. She knew the handwriting. She'd memorized it from dozens of letters. She found a quiet corner and opened it with trembling fingers. When she read the words, "Will you marry me?" she had to sit down. The paper blurred, as tears filled her eyes. She'd convinced herself it was impossible, that distance and difference would kill what had started in the ruins. But here was proof that some things survive. She wrote back immediately. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The paperwork was nightmarish. Anna had to prove she wasn't a war criminal, that she'd never been a member of the Nazi Party, that she had no contagious diseases, that she was of good moral character, whatever that meant in a world that had gone insane and was only now waking up. She was interrogated by American officials who wanted to know why a German woman thought she deserved to marry an American hero. She endured medical examinations that felt invasive and humiliating. She collected letters of recommendation from doctors, chaplains, even some of the American soldiers whose lives she'd saved. It took 8 months. 8 months of bureaucratic purgatory, of forms and interviews and background checks. James spent those months working on his parents' farm and calling the immigration office so often they knew his voice. He wrote to his congressman. He contacted veterans organizations. He refused to let go. In September of 1947, Anna received her approval. She was to board a ship from Hamburg in October, bound for New York. She would be one of 150 German war brides on that voyage, women who had fallen in love with their supposed enemies, who were leaving behind everything familiar for a future they could barely imagine. The night before she left, Anna visited the cemetery where German soldiers were buried in rows so long they seemed to stretch to the horizon. She found Friedrich's name on a memorial stone, one of thousands. She knelt in the grass and spoke to him in the darkness, telling him about James, about America, about the second chance she never thought she'd have. "I loved you," she whispered. "I'll always love you. But I have to live now. I have to try." The wind moved through the trees, and she chose to believe it was his answer. The ship that carried Anna to America was called the SS Marine Flasher. a converted troop transport that smelled of diesel and salt. The German brides were housed below deck, in quarters that had once held soldiers heading to war. Now they held women, heading toward peace, or what they hoped would be peace. They came from all over Germany. Farm girls and city sophisticates, widows and orphans, women who spoke perfect English, and women who knew only 3 phrases. What they shared was a kind of desperate courage, the willingness to cross an ocean for love in a world that still looked at them with suspicion. Anna spent most of the voyage on deck, watching the Atlantic roll past in shades of gray and green. She thought about all the soldiers who had crossed this water going the other way, toward Europe, toward death. She thought about James making this same journey 2 years ago, leaving her behind. Now she was following him, pulling against the tide of history. The other brides gathered in small groups, sharing stories and anxieties. Many had children, tiny faces peering out from bundled blankets. Some women had met their husbands after the war, in the chaos of occupation. Others, like Anna, had fallen in love in the ruins, when the world was still smoking. They taught each other English phrases. They practiced American customs. They tried to prepare for a country that had been taught to hate them. On the 7th night of the crossing, a storm came up. The ship pitched and rolled, and the brides huddled below deck, sick and terrified. Anna held a young woman named Margaretha who couldn't stop crying, convinced the ship would sink and they'd all drown before reaching the New World. "We'll make it," Anna told her, speaking with a confidence she didn't feel. "We've survived worse than storms." When they finally sighted the Statue of Liberty, rising green and impossibly tall from the harbor, every woman on board came up on deck. Many were crying. Some were praying. Anna just stared, trying to comprehend what that statue meant. Freedom, refuge, a fresh start. All the things Germany had lost. All the things she hoped to find. James was waiting at the dock in New York, wearing his best suit and holding flowers that were already wilting in the August heat. He'd been standing there for 3 hours, terrified the ship would be delayed, that something would go wrong at the last minute, that this happiness couldn't possibly be real. When he saw Anna coming down the gangplank, a small suitcase in her hand and her coat buttoned despite the warmth, he felt his throat close up with emotion. She saw him and stopped. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the crowd of reuniting families. Then she smiled, that same small smile he remembered from the camp, and he moved forward, pushing through the crowd, not caring who he bumped into. When he reached her, he pulled her into his arms and held her like she might disappear if he let go. "You came?" he whispered into her hair. "I came," she said. Her English was better now, practiced from letters and lessons. "I will always come." They were married 3 days later in a small chapel in Brooklyn, with James's army buddy serving as best man and a German-American neighbor as Anna's witness. The ceremony was simple, almost austere. Anna wore a white dress borrowed from James's cousin. James wore his uniform because it was the only formal clothing he owned. The priest spoke about love conquering hate, about the healing power of forgiveness, about how God worked in mysterious ways. Anna understood about half of it, but she understood the important part. The moment James slipped a real ring onto her finger, replacing the bullet shell band he'd given her in the rubble, and promised to love her until death. When they kissed, she tasted salt and realized she was crying. Happy tears, sad tears, tears for everything that had been lost and everything they were trying to build. James held her face in his hands and wiped the tears away with his thumbs, and she thought, this is what peace looks like. 2 broken people, choosing to heal together. The train ride to Iowa took 2 days. Anna pressed her face to the window and watched America scroll past. Cities giving way to farmland, endless fields of corn and wheat stretching to horizons so wide they made her dizzy. Germany was small and cramped, every inch of land contested and cultivated. This country seemed limitless. She wondered if a person could get lost in all that space, or if the openness might actually heal the claustrophobia of war. James's parents met them at the station in Cedar Rapids. His father was a tall, silent man who shook Anna's hand formally and said, "Welcome." His mother hugged her. which Anna hadn't expected. "You look like you need feeding," Mrs. Carter said, and Anna laughed because it was true. She'd been hungry for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be full. The farmhouse was small but clean, with gingham curtains and a kitchen that smelled of bread. James's room was exactly as he'd described it in letters. Narrow bed, faded quilt, a shelf of books he'd read as a boy. That first night, lying beside him in the darkness, Anna felt a wave of dislocation so strong she had to grip the mattress to keep from floating away. This was real. This was her life now. She was married to an American farmer's son, sleeping in Iowa, as far from Berlin as the moon. James felt her tension and pulled her close. "You okay?" "Strange," she admitted. "Everything is strange. Good strange or bad strange? I don't know yet." He kissed her forehead. "We have time to figure it out." But time, it turned out, was not as generous as they'd hoped. The town of Mason Creek, where the Carter farm was located, had a population of 843 people. 842 of them were intensely curious about the German woman who had married James Carter. Some were welcoming. Many were not. Anna felt the stares when she walked to the general store. She heard the whispers that cut off when she approached. Someone spray-painted Nazi on the mailbox. The postmaster's wife refused to serve her, forcing James to collect their mail instead. At church, an elderly man spat at her feet and called her a murderer. James stepped between them, his hands clenched into fists. But Anna pulled him back. "Not worth it," she said in German, forgetting to switch to English. The German words made everything worse. People who might have been neutral turned hostile. James found himself defending Anna constantly, arguing with neighbors he'd known his whole life. His father retreated into silence, embarrassed by the attention. His mother tried to help, teaching Anna to cook American food, to understand American customs, but even she struggled with the looks she got in town, the questions about why she was harboring the enemy. Anna felt like she was suffocating. She'd escaped Germany only to find herself in another kind of prison, one made of judgment and fear. She thought about leaving, about going back to Germany or disappearing to a city where no one knew her story. But every time she considered it, she looked at James and saw the hope in his eyes, the belief that this would get better, that love was strong enough to change minds. She decided to try another way. She went to the town doctor, an older man named Dr. Harrison who'd served in the Great War. She offered to volunteer at his clinic. He looked at her suspiciously and asked about her qualifications. She showed him her nursing credentials, her letters of recommendation, the photographs of her working in German hospitals. He studied them for a long time, then said, "Monday mornings, 8 o'clock. Don't be late." It was a test, and Anna knew it. She arrived every Monday at 7:45, impeccably dressed, her English carefully practiced. She worked without complaint, cleaning instruments, changing dressings, calming frightened children. Dr. Harrison watched her like a hawk for the first month, waiting for her to make a mistake, to reveal some hidden darkness. But Anna was a good nurse, maybe even a great one. She had hands that knew how to comfort and skills honed by years of wartime medicine. The breakthrough came in December, when a farmer's son was brought in with a ruptured appendix. Dr. Harrison was at another emergency, and Anna was alone with the boy, who was going into septic shock. She didn't hesitate. She'd performed emergency surgeries in basements and bomb shelters with nothing but boiled water and determination. A small-town clinic was practically luxurious in comparison. When Dr. Harrison arrived 20 minutes later, Anna had the boy stabilized, his fever coming down, his pain managed. The doctor stared at her, then at the boy, then back at her. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Berlin," she said simply. "In the war." He nodded slowly. "You saved his life." "I tried. Same as always." After that, things changed. The farmer whose son Anna saved told everyone who would listen about the German nurse, who had steady hands and a kind heart. Other patients started requesting her. Women who had refused to acknowledge her in the street began nodding when they passed. It wasn't acceptance, not quite, but it was a crack in the wall. James watched Anna bloom under the work. She came home exhausted but satisfied, speaking rapid-fire English about patients and procedures. She laughed more. The tight fear around her eyes eased. And slowly, painfully slowly, Mason Creek began to make room for her. On their first anniversary, James took Anna to the cemetery where his brother Tom was buried. She'd asked to go several times, but he'd put it off. Not sure he was ready. But that day felt right. They stood in front of the simple stone marked with Tom's name and the dates of his too short life. Anna knelt and placed flowers on the grave, wildflowers she'd picked from the field behind the farmhouse. "I wish I could have known him," she said softly. James's voice was rough when he answered. "He would have liked you. Tom liked everyone. I'm sorry he died." "Me too." James crouched beside her. "But I think he'd understand why I brought you here. Why I fell in love with you." Tom believed in giving people second chances. He said everyone deserves kindness, even when they don't deserve it. Anna touched the stone, tracing Tom's name with her finger. "I will try to be worthy," she said, "of his sacrifice, of your love, of this chance. You already are." They stayed there for a long time. The three of them connected across death and war, finding a kind of communion in the quiet. The following spring, Anna discovered she was pregnant. The news terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She'd lost one child during the war, a miscarriage brought on by malnutrition and stress, and the grief had nearly destroyed her. Now, carrying life again, she felt vulnerable in ways she'd forgotten. But James was ecstatic. He painted the spare room blue and yellow, neutral colors for whatever came. His mother knitted blankets and booties. Even his father smiled, just slightly, when he thought no one was looking. Anna worked at the clinic until her 8th month, when Dr. Harrison finally ordered her to rest. She spent those last weeks sitting on the porch, watching the corn grow tall and green, feeling the baby kick and roll inside her. She thought about what kind of world this child would inherit. Would people see her daughter as American or as German? Would the war follow them forever, or could the next generation finally be free of it? On October 3rd, 1948, Anna gave birth to a daughter. They named her Hope, because that was what she represented. The birth was difficult, and for a few terrifying hours, Dr. Harrison wasn't sure both mother and child would survive. But Anna was stubborn, and Hope was fierce, and they pulled through together. When James held his daughter for the first time, he wept openly. This tiny person, with her mother's dark eyes and his father's chin, was proof that something good could come from tragedy. That love could create life, even in a world that had specialized in death. The christening was held at the Mason Creek Community Church, the same place Anna had been spat at 2 years before. The sanctuary was full. Some people came out of genuine warmth. Others came out of curiosity. A few came because they'd been patients of Anna's and felt they owed her at least their presence. When the priest asked if anyone objected to this child being welcomed into the community of faith, there was a long, terrible silence. Then old Mr. Henderson, who had lost 2 sons in the war, stood up. Everyone tensed, expecting condemnation, but he said, "I welcome this child, and I welcome her mother, who has shown this town what grace looks like." He sat down heavily, his wife gripping his hand. After that, others stood. The farmer whose son Anna saved, Dr. Harrison, the postmaster, his wife conspicuously silent beside him. One by one, they stood and welcomed hope into the world, and in doing so, they finally welcomed Anna too. Years passed. Hope grew into a bright, curious child who spoke English with an Iowa accent and German with her mother's soft Berlin vowels. Anna continued working at the clinic, eventually becoming Dr. Harrison's partner when he semi-retired. James expanded the farm, bringing in new crops and modern equipment. They had 2 more children, a son named Thomas, after the uncle he'd never meet, and another daughter, Margaret, after James's mother. The town that had once painted slurs on their mailbox threw them a party on their 10th anniversary. The headline in the Mason Creek Gazette read, "From Enemies to Family. The Carter Story." Anna kept that clipping in her Bible, a reminder of how far they'd traveled, not in miles but in mercy. But the war never completely let go. Anna still woke sometimes from nightmares, gasping in German, reliving surgeries performed under bombardment. James still flinched at loud noises, still saw his brother's face in crowds. They'd learned to hold each other through the bad nights, to whisper reassurances in the dark, to remember that surviving wasn't the same as healing. But it was a start. In 1965, their daughter, Hope, now 17, was assigned a school project on family history. She found an old photograph in the attic. Anna standing in what used to be a Berlin hospital, wearing a stained nurse's uniform, looking directly at the camera with exhausted, defiant eyes. Another photo showed James in full combat gear, covered in mud, holding a rifle. Hope brought the photographs to her mother and asked the question Anna had been dreading for years. "How did you and Dad meet?" Anna looked at the photographs for a long time. She thought about lying, about simplifying, about protecting her daughter from the complicated truth. But Hope deserved better than sanitized history. She deserved the real story, with all its pain and grace. So Anna told her. She told her about the war, about being terrified and starving, and convinced she'd die, as punishment for her country's sins. She told her about James lowering his rifle and seeing her as human. She told her about falling in love in a refugee camp, about letters that crossed an ocean, about choosing to trust that kindness was stronger than hate. She told her everything, holding nothing back. When she finished, Hope was crying. "People must have hated you," she whispered. "Some did," Anna admitted. "Some still do. But more people chose to see past where I came from and focus on who I was trying to become. Was it worth it? Leaving everything, coming here, dealing with all that hate?" Anna looked out the kitchen window at the farm, at James fixing a fence in the distance, at the land where her children had grown up safe and loved. "Every single day," she said. "Forgiveness is the hardest thing in the world. But it's also the only thing that saves us." That evening, Hope showed her parents what she'd written for her school project. She'd titled it "The Enemy Who Became My Mother," a war bride's journey. She'd included the photographs, Anna's nursing credentials, even some of the hateful letters Anna had received in those early years. But she'd also included testimonials from patients Anna had saved, from neighbors who'd changed their minds, from Dr. Harrison, who wrote, "Anna Carter is proof that who we are matters more than where we come from." The project won first place at the county fair and was published in the Mason Creek Gazette. Anna received letters from all over the state, from other war brides who'd hidden their stories out of shame or fear, thanking her for being brave enough to tell the truth. She answered every letter, building a network of women who understood what it meant to love across enemy lines. In 1976, America's bicentennial year, Anna and James were invited to speak at a community event about immigration and integration. They stood together on a small stage in the town square, the same square where Anna had once been spat at, and told their story to a crowd of 300 people. They spoke about the war, about falling in love in rubble, about the long, hard work of building trust. They spoke about how peace is made not by governments but by individual people choosing mercy over revenge. When they finished, the crowd stood and applauded. Old soldiers who'd fought in Europe applauded. The mayor proclaimed it Carter Day in Mason Creek. A reporter from Des Moines came to interview them, and their story ran in papers across the Midwest. The war bride who won a town's heart. But the moment Anna treasured most came later, when the crowd had dispersed. A young woman approached her, shy and uncertain. She introduced herself as the granddaughter of the man who had spat at Anna in church 30 years ago. "My grandfather wanted me to tell you something before he died," she said. "He wanted you to know he was sorry, that he'd been wrong, that you were the bravest person he ever met." Anna took the woman's hands and squeezed them gently. "Tell him I forgave him a long time ago," she said. "Tell him that's what we do. We forgive, and we build something better." James Carter died in 1994, at the age of 72, on the farm he'd worked his entire life. He went peacefully, in his sleep, with Anna beside him. At his funeral, The church was packed with people whose lives he'd touched. Farmers he'd helped, veterans he'd served with, and patients Anna had treated who wanted to honor the man who'd made her story possible. The eulogy was delivered by Thomas Carter, their son, who spoke about his father's courage in war and his even greater courage in peace. "My father," Thomas said, "taught me that the enemy is whoever we choose to see as the enemy, and the hero is whoever we choose to see as human." Anna lived another 15 years, working at the clinic until she was 85, long past any reasonable retirement age. She'd become an institution in Mason Creek, the German nurse who'd won over a skeptical town through sheer stubborn kindness. Young mothers brought their children to her because she had the gentlest hands. Old veterans came to her because she understood what war did to a soul. She was, improbably, beloved. On her 90th birthday, the town threw her a party. The mayor presented her with a key to the city. Dr. Harrison's grandson, now running the clinic, announced they were renaming it the Anna Carter Community Health Center. Hope gave a speech about her mother's courage, her grace, her refusal to let hate win. And Anna, standing in front of all these people who had become her people, felt a sense of completion she'd never expected to find. "I came to this country as an enemy," she said, her voice still strong despite her age, still carrying the trace of a German accent. "I was welcomed as a wife. I became a neighbor, a friend, a citizen. America gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. It taught me that we are not defined by our worst moments, but by what we choose to do after them." She paused, looking out at the crowd, seeing the children and grandchildren of people who had once wanted her gone. "I have lived long enough to see hate transform into love," she continued, "to see fear become friendship, to see the impossible become ordinary. If there is any legacy I want to leave, it is this. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is the strongest thing humans can do. It is the only thing that lets us survive our own history." Anna Müller Carter died in her sleep on a winter morning in 2009, at the age of 90. She was buried beside James in the Mason Creek Cemetery, under a simple stone that read, "Wife, mother, healer. She chose love." At her funeral, people came from 3 states. War brides she'd corresponded with over decades. Patients she'd treated as children who were now bringing their own grandchildren to say goodbye. The German ambassador sent a letter praising her as a bridge between nations. But the most moving moment came from Hope, Anna's eldest daughter. Now 61 and a grandmother herself. She stood at the podium and held up that old photograph, the one of Anna in her stained nurse's uniform in Berlin, looking defiantly at the camera. "My mother used to say that every person contains multitudes," Hope said. "We are the worst things we've done and the best things we've done, and everything in between." The war made her an enemy. Love made her a wife. Courage made her a citizen. And mercy made her immortal. Hope looked out at the crowd, her eyes bright with tears. "She taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing who you want to be despite what you've been through. She chose to be kind in a world that had been cruel. She chose to heal in a world that specialized in hurting. And she chose to love when love was the hardest, most revolutionary thing she could do." Outside, snow fell softly on the Iowa fields, covering everything in white, making the world look clean and new. And in that cemetery, under that stone, Anna Müller Carter rested beside the man who had loved her enough to see past the uniform, past the accent, past everything except the human being standing in front of him. 2 people who should have been enemies, who became something better. 2 people who proved that war ends not when the shooting stops, but when we choose to stop carrying the hate. Their story became legend in Mason Creek and beyond. Teachers told it to students learning about World War II and the aftermath. Museums displayed their letters, artifacts of love surviving destruction. Historians wrote about the thousands of war brides who'd made similar journeys, crossing enemy lines to build families in foreign lands. Anna and James became symbols of something larger than themselves. The possibility of redemption, the power of mercy, the stubborn resilience of hope. In the house on the Carter farm, Hope's granddaughter found a box in the attic. Inside were all of Anna's letters from those years after the war, carefully preserved and wrapped in ribbon. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the words were clear. Love letters written in broken English, describing homesickness and determination, fear and courage, the daily work of becoming someone new. At the bottom of the box was a final letter, written in Anna's careful handwriting, dated the week before she died. It was addressed to whoever finds this, a message sent forward into a future she wouldn't see. I was the enemy, it read. I wore the uniform of a nation that committed unspeakable evil. I cannot change that. I cannot erase that. But I can tell you this. We are more than the worst things done in our names. We are more than the flags we were born under. We are what we choose to be, every day, in every small act of kindness or cruelty. I chose kindness. James chose mercy. Together, we chose love. And that love created a family, a home, a legacy. If you are reading this, you are part of that legacy. You are proof that hate does not have to have the last word. Remember that. Remember us. Remember that forgiveness is always possible, even when it seems impossible. Especially then. The letter was framed and hung in the Anna Carter Community Health Center, where new generations of nurses and doctors pass it every day. Where patients waiting for care read it and remember that healing takes many forms. Where the story of the war bride who married her enemy continues to inspire people to choose mercy over revenge, hope over hate, love over fear. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. We can choose who we want to be, despite who we were told we had to be. We can choose connection over division. We can choose to see the human being standing across from us, even when everything tells us to see only an enemy. Anna and James did that. Against all odds, against history itself, they did that. And in doing so, they proved something essential about the human spirit. That it can survive anything, endure anything, forgive anything, if we're brave enough to let it. That love, real love, the kind that crosses oceans and centuries and the unbridgeable chasms of war, is not just possible but necessary, not just beautiful but revolutionary, not just a feeling but a choice we make every single day until the day we die. Their story ended in a quiet cemetery in Iowa. But the truth they discovered, the grace they embodied, the love they fought for that story continues. In every person who chooses mercy, in every heart that softens toward the stranger, in every moment when we see past the uniform to the person underneath, that story never ends. It just keeps being written, one act of forgiveness at a time, forever.